Thank you very much, Evelyn. I remember the first time I came to the HES meetings. That was back in 1994. At that time, I was still a student in Cambridge. It was a conference organized by the late Larry Moss. And I was pleasantly surprised at the time that so many people shared my passion for history of economic thought. And here am I mean, years, 20 years later, more than 20 years later, before you to deliver this, this presidential address. And most of us, if not everybody, will travel to come here to the conference. And traveling has become very much part of our personal life and especially our professional life. And this is the kind of reflection that I'd like to do here with you, that I'm inviting you to do here tonight with me. It's about traveling as a historiographical issue from the perspective of history of economic thought. So what I'm going to do is to raise some issues related to that and especially present to you a case study of Douglas North, the well-known, famous American institutionalist economist who passed away in 2015. He's traveled to Brazil in 1961. So, yeah, I'd like to start with a quotation from North that is in a pamphlet. It's not really an article or a book. It's a pamphlet he wrote in 2001. And what caught my attention here is the fact that is the strong impact that traveling had on him, and the way that he distinguished between the information he got from the sheer numbers and the feeling of actually visiting poor countries, and how that made clear to him the contrast between the rich country where he was born and the regions where he used to live, North America and the countries that he used to visit in Europe and so forth, and the poor countries that he experienced. And the very first country that he visited, the poor country, I mean, was Brazil. And that was in 1961. In June 1961. So I'm going to use here archive material that I got from the Economists Papers Project at Duke University that you are all very much familiar with. And this, of course, is part of the Douglas North papers. So what was the context of his visit in June 1961? That was the Alliance for Progress, a very important and ambitious diplomatic effort by the Kennedy administration in the context of the Cold War. So there was a lot of money involved, and they were particularly concerned with the northeast of Brazil, because the northeast region of Brazil is the largest poor area in the Americas. And it was, and it probably still is. And at the time, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, 1960, there was a lot of concern that the same thing could happen in Brazilian Northeast. So that is the context of his visit during the Cold War. And what did North do in Brazil? He delivered lectures in Rio, and but maybe more important than that, he went to visit other cities like Recife, the headquarters of this Agency for the Development of the Northeast, Sudene in Portuguese, where he met the director of Sudene, Celso Furtado, who was a very well-known and influential Brazilian economist, an economic historian like North himself. The material at the archives, apart from two memoranda that he wrote about the Northeast, and the reason for those memoranda is the fact that Furtado had a meeting scheduled with John Kennedy, the American president, at the White House in July, mid-July 1961. So just a couple of weeks after North finished his visit to Brazil. So he wrote these two memoranda about the Northeast as an economic advisor to the North American Department of State, the U.S. Department of State, and he kept a diary of his travels to Brazil. These diaries, they are really, I mean, wonderful. They are very rich, not just what they review about Brazil, but especially what they review about North himself as a person, as an economist, and about his perception, the impact of visiting for the first time this underdeveloped, but at the same time very contradictory society. He traveled, of course, after that, especially after he got the Nobel Prize in 1993. He traveled a lot abroad, including, of course, poor countries, but he never kept a diary again. That was a travel diary. That was the only time he did that. So, of course, this raises a question: why did he keep the diaries? What did he do with that? What use that had for him? And the fact is that it was only, so that took place in 1961, but it was only in the 1980s that North actually became actively interested in the economic dynamics and political dynamics as well of poor countries, of developing countries. And the reason for that is that in the 1980s there was a lot of debate about divergence of economic growth between rich and poor countries, the debate about convergence in growth economics, and he felt that he could contribute to that from the point of view of neo-institutionalist economic thought. So, one of the points that I want to make in this paper, in this presentation, is the fact that when North eventually decide to enter into this field of development economics and applying the institutional framework to understand why some countries fall behind others, like Brazil compared to United States or North America. When he did that, he used ideas or observations or remarks that he had made during his visit to Brazil. So either because that got stuck in his mind or because he actually used his notes that he kept during all those years, those decades. So from a more general point of view, the question that I want to raise here is, what is the role of traveling? I mean, if any, in the history of economic thought. You may think that the answer to that question is more or less obvious. Of course, traveling is important. It's important for our lives. It's important for any economist, but not so fast. I mean, there has been some controversy there. The first travel diary by an economist that became public, and of course, North's diary are not public. They are there in the archives, but they were published, made available to a large audience, were Thomas Malthus' diaries of his travels to Scandinavia, especially Norway, in 1799, and they were published only in 1966. They were discovered by accident, and then they were published then. And of course, the publication of Malthus' diaries attract a lot of attention. And so it's interesting. Here the date is wrong. It's George Stigler should be 1967, not 1976. So past HES president, we should not forget that, George Stigler. He was HES president in the 1970s, the early 1970s, I believe. And he held an HES meeting in Chicago. So I was told by David Levy that he held a HES meeting there in Chicago at that time. So, according to George Stigler, I mean, he didn't see much relevance, much analytical relevance in Malthus' diaries. And, but I'm not interested really specifically in Malthus' diaries per se, but Stigler's general reflection that were provoked by his reading of the diaries in his review of the book. And he wrote that a foreign land is an extraordinarily reluctant source of reliable information, let alone of scientific relationships. And then there is this part that is reproduced there in the PowerPoint. No important economic idea of which I have ever heard had an empirical depth to foreign or domestic travel. So this is typical Stigler, a very strong statement. Of course, Stigler got involved in other debates. For instance, the role of biography in economics. He denied that biography had any role in the study of history. That was a minority view, but it was influential nevertheless. So he also denied, as part of that broader view about biography, that traveling was of any relevance. He did not deny that some specific cases, and he could not deny, for instance, Darwin, Tocqueville's travel to the United States. He mentioned that and he said, well, those are exceptions, but not in economics. And then he complemented another very interesting passage from that same review by Stigler. He wrote, that was a corollary of this statement. If Fulbright, the funding institution, if Fulbright wished to encourage purely scientific work, he should have given grants to live for 9 months near a good American library, preferably surrounded by a committeeless zone, a zone without any committees to waste time. But and then he continued saying, the profession would have fewer splendid meals in cases of dysentery and more well-reasoned arguments. So he was very clear about that. At the end, he said, well, but really, Malthus had a very good time. He enjoyed himself. And since consumption is the sole end of production, that's okay. So traveling he enjoyed, he had a good time, but the information he got in Scandinavia, according to Stigler, was really not relevant. Okay, so another interesting reflection about traveling that I'd like to call your attention to is Herbert Simon, another famous economist, who in his autobiography published in 1991, he enunciated what he himself called the Travel Theorem. He described that as the Travel Theorem. According to the travel, I'll read it for you, the passage from his book. Anything that can be learned by a normal American adult on a trip to a foreign country of less than 1 year's duration can be learned more quickly, cheaply, and easily by visiting the San Diego Public Library. Because he lived in San Diego at that time. Or any other major city. The theorem holds in spades if the traveler does not have a fluent knowledge of the language of the country. So the context for that is that at the time he was advising the Ford Foundation, that he was concerned that before any mission, they send an economist just to do some field work for 2 weeks and then come back to the United States with some information about that country. And he said that was a waste of time and money, and that it would be much better just raising the necessary information here or in North America. And he said that what he was also concerned about is to separate the joy from traveling from getting information from traveling. So if the only purpose of traveling is to get information, then you can do that at home. So in order to justify the need for traveling, you need something more, you need something else. So if journeys, that's what's written there, they are indeed undertaken, the reason are and should be other than just gathering information. Simon's travel theorem is not so well known among us historians of economics, but for instance, in economic psychology, they sometimes use that to study, for instance, why if all the information about music, for instance, is contained in CDs and other sources, people still go to live show presentations. So the idea has to do with physical presence and or the importance, the relevance of actual conversation instead of just reading, that kind of thing. I don't have time to discuss that, but it has to do with something that is quite important here in my talk, sensorial experience. The sensorial experience provided by actual contact by traveling. But the fact is that sometimes the information is not really available or readily available. Then we have the case of anthropology. Here I'm referring just to give an example to Levi-Strauss. It's not an innocent example because this is a very famous, maybe the most famous travel book of the 20th century. That's a journey by Levi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, to Brazil to study the Brazilian Indians in the 1930s, and he published in 1955. It's interesting, and I think it's of relevance, that economists like von Mises and Frank Knight first and then von Mises after him, they very much distinguished economists from other social scientists in that sense, especially economists from anthropologists. So according to Frank Knight said, or he wrote, we are not anthropologists, we are economists. So we are not looking for dissimilarities between economic agents. We are looking for similarities. We are looking for homogeneity, not for heterogeneity. So we are completely different from anthropologists. So Mrs. wrote, the economist, like the biologist and the psychologist, deals with matters that are present and operative in every man. That distinguishes his work from that of the ethnologist, who wants to record the moral habits of primitive tribes. Then there is that quotation with this very significant word, armchair. So the economist can do his or her work by sitting in the armchair. There is no need to displace. And that what distinguishes the economist from other people is not the esoteric opportunity to deal with some special material not accessible to others, but the way he looks upon things and discovering them aspects which other people fail to notice. So this is the sense of homogeneity. I want to make a distinction here, and I like to point out that some of, or many of my sources are sitting here tonight, are among you, so I'm going to refer to them at the end of my presentation. So there is this distinction here between armchair theorists, armchair observers, and armchair travelers as well. Okay, so armchair theorists are those, this is the description, armchair observers are those who use actual data, observations, but they don't do, the data is available. They don't have to travel in order to get access to the data. The data is available. And armchair travelers, those were more common in the past, when they use travel information collected by travelers, not by themselves. It's interesting that the origins of the term, the English word and in Portuguese and in many other Western languages, it comes from Greek, as so many other words, and originally it has to do with traveling. So there was traveling and to theorize and to travel, they were closely connected. This James Clifford, an expert on travel writing, he called attention to that. So the Greek term denotes a practice of travel and observation. A man sent by the police to another city to witness a religious ceremony. So theory in that sense is a product of displacement, comparison, a certain distance. To theorize, one leaves home, and one gets back home as well. This is very important. But the fact is that that's the etymological origin of the word, but that's not exactly the meaning we attached or to the word to theory nowadays. But it's still true that the whole literature, and there is a very large literature on travel writing, the travel logs and so forth, they are based on this notion, a very basic, essential notion of otherness. That is, this binary opposition between home and elsewhere, this sort of dialectic relation between home and elsewhere. So traveling involves necessarily a comparison between home, your place of departure, and the place where you are going to. And without that perspective is absolutely essential. So all travel writing exists in a dialectical relationship between two distinct places, that designated by the writer and perhaps also the readers as home, and that designated as the cultural order. It's interesting that with David Hume, maybe that's when you may detect a protective kind of attitude towards traveling or theory, in the sense that theory is a home on the road to knowledge, protecting against the contamination of the strange or the other. So Hume and other philosophers, and also economists like Adam Smith, for instance, in the 18th century, they were very skeptical about travelers' tales that differ too much from the kind of environment that looked familiar to them, like in England or Scotland or Western Europe or France and so forth. So that was this notion that a theory is a home on the road to knowledge, grounded the certainty of experiences in stable ways, in protecting knowledge against the contamination of the strange or the other. That's a quotation from a book by Coase. And that played a very important role in the way British empiricism was developed at the time. That is to get rid of very strange observations and to restrict yourself to what is more familiar. So from that point of view, Mises was not so far from Hume and the classical economists in general. But at the same time, you must be aware that otherness is a matter of degree. And I'm going to discuss in a few minutes the role of distinguishing between national characters, and that was important for Hume and for other classical economists as well. So my point here is that although a protective attitude has developed towards established theory, in the sense that any challenge to what is more or less the kind of behavior that is regarded as normal, this is somehow disregarded or put away. The fact is that economists have traveled widely and gained important new insights, especially when we are dealing with theories that are still not that established. They have not become, let's say, orthodox yet, and they are in their initial stages of development. And so what I want to do here for the rest of my talk is in part to challenge Stigler, in the sense that I'm going to provide a sort of data set of travels by economists that really led them to discover new insights or even to develop new theories as a byproduct of their travels, and also challenge aspects of Mises' methodological claim. Okay. So let's do a tour of economists' travels through time. Starting with the 18th century. The fact of the matter is that economists at that time, they usually or always did not travel outside Europe, outside their own continent. And one reason for that, of course, is that the costs and risks of traveling long distance were huge. I mean, to give you an idea, although I don't think this comes as something completely new to you, but traveling to India, for instance, would take 4 months each way from England to India. Traveling to China at the beginning of the 19th century, it would take a year both ways, 6 months each way. So you have the costs of traveling, the time of traveling, and the risks of traveling. It was very risky. So for instance, the East India Company, which was the only company that provided transportation from England to India, I mean, they did not provide, it was part of their business, but they never paid or covered traveling expenses for their economists, like Thomas Malthus, or James Mill, or John Stuart Mill, or Richard Jones and others. They never did that. And I believe if they offer John Stuart Mill a chance to visit India, I think he would refuse the offer, because spending almost a year traveling, that was not the kind of activity that Mill or Adam Smith or Malthus, I believe, would would entertain them. Okay. But they read travel reports, and they read that a lot. Travel reports were very important, but at the same time, as I mentioned before, these travel reports were often regarded as unreliable. So, for instance, Adam Smith, reacting to accounts of the efficiency of transportation systems in China and the Hindustan in The Wealth of Nations, he wrote, "The accounts of those works, however, which have been transmitted to Europe have generally been drawn up by weak and wandering travelers, frequently by stupid and lying missionaries. If they had been examined by more intelligent eyes, and if the accounts had been reported by more faithful witnesses, they would not perhaps appear so wonderful." So there is a literature about how they learn how to read travel reports. That was very important, especially at the end of the 18th century. John Locke, for instance, he took them for granted. I mean, he usually was not critical of the information provided by travel reports. But by the end of the 18th century, that kind of attitude changed quite a bit. But on the other hand, there were some travelers who were considered more reliable. For instance, this French physician, Francois Bonier, who traveled to China and Hindustan around the very end of the 16th century, and he was an important source for Richard Jones and for Marx. So Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production is based on travel reports. Of course, like the classics, he never left Europe. And so his notion of his very clear-cut distinction between capitalism and the Asiatic mode of production is based on travel reports, especially by this guy, Francois Bonier, the Oriental despotism, as they call it at the time. Australia is another case. I mean, they did not travel to Australia either. I'm talking here about the countries that were part of the Commonwealth. According to Crawford Goodwin, who wrote a pioneer book about how the British economists, intellectuals perceived Australia, Australia was much more an abstraction than a living reality at the time. But that changed, from our perspective as historians of thought, when Jevons migrated to Australia from 1854 to 59. This story has been told in many sources, it's well known, but the point that I want to really to call your attention here, because this data set, my purpose here is to show, as I said before, that there are several important instances when traveling played a role in discovery of new economic ideas or insights, is that it awakened his approach to economics as a mathematical science. So the railway debates, the debates about the effects of railways on income distribution and capital accumulation in Australia, that caught Jevons' attention, and that was instrumental in arising this interest in him. At the time, he was not an economist yet, of course, and then he went back to England, and then he started doing his important work in economics. Two other British travelers to Australia were Beatrice and Sidney Webb. But in contrast with Malthus, they were not all impressed. They traveled to Australia in the 1890s. And as Jevons, of course, he kept a journal of his travels to Australia and correspondence. But again, like Malthus, that was only disclosed and published much later in 1972, when that became available. It was not available before that. And that is also the case with this travel by the Webbs. In the 1890s, they wrote a diary, and the diary was published also in the mid-1960s. And they didn't like so much because their idea of democracy apparently was not confirmed by what they saw in Australia. But again, according to, and I'm quoting here from Crawford Goodwin again, the reason why their perception was a bit, I mean, it didn't reflect really what the reality, but their own prejudices, is that they were, according to Goodwin, they were insular in outlook, poor travelers, snobbish, and arrogant. And so it takes some skill to be a good traveler and to observe around you. All right. So now I come to another very important example, one of my favorites in this in our tour. It's the German economist Friedrich Engels. That was his exile in the United States in the 1820s, more exactly from 1825 to 1830. He came to the United States for political reasons. It was an exile, but only for 5. It was not a permanent move. And Friedrich Engels was one of the most influential economists of the 19th century, the second most influential German economist after Karl Marx. And his nationalist approach to growth, it was really developed as a product of his American experience. So he stayed in Philadelphia, but he traveled around as well. So he wrote in his book published in 1841, when fate led me to America, I left all books behind me. The best book on political economy one can read in that country, that is America, the United States, is life itself. Here before one's eyes, wilderness becomes rich and powerful states. Here it first became clear to me that nations pass through different stages of economic development. A process which in Europe would require many centuries here takes place under our very eyes. So it was not just really, although that was very important, the observations he made about this transformation of the American economy, the railways, for instance, which for him was a very important part of the economic system, the transportation, and the dynamics of the American economy, but also the fact that he came into contact with American ideas about protectionism and industrial development, and that was also important. So this actual close contact with those ideas and conversation with local theoreticians about that. Another important example of a visitor to the United States at that time, I mean in 1834, between 1834 and 1836, was the English writer and economist and sociologist. I had Martineau, and that led to 3 important pioneer books on economic sociology. So, of course, she was a traveler, and so this is a typical and a very important case of a travelogue. I mean, she left a travel document that's quite important. So she wrote books like Society in America in 1837, How to Observe Morals and Manners in 1838, and Retrospect of Western Travel in 1838. She was particularly concerned with the position of women, or the condition of women in American society, with slavery, of course, which was a big difference between England and the United States at the time. And and she was a good friend of Darwin, so that was part of also of that context. And it's interesting that in between List's visit to America and Martineau's visit, Tocqueville came to the United States. That was exactly in between. It was in 1831, from April 1831 to March 1832, that he came to the United States, and he wrote in 1835 his classic book, Democracy in America. All right. What about South America? We're talking about North America. In South America, in the post-colonial period, a particularly relevant example here is the French economist Courcelles Senouille, who was hired by the Chilean government to teach in Santiago economics and also to give advice on fiscal and monetary matters. That is the period when he traveled to Chile. That is a particularly important, interesting example because it's an early illustration of the so-called Mone Doctors. That that is economists who travel in order to offer advice and also quite often with monetary or financial implications. This is the idea of a money doctor. I mean, usually we study the dissemination of economic ideas in terms of how ideas travel. Here we're thinking about not just ideas traveling, but economists themselves traveling and lending their knowledge to other countries. Since economic theory or economics, it's usually associated to or important economic ideas to countries that are more advanced or developed. So this asymmetry, it really brings out the role of this so-called the money doctors. That's an expression created by the American economist Kammerer to describe himself in the early 20th century. But not just that. Coase was well known for his free banking doctrine. What is particularly relevant here is that it was during his visit to Chile, during his period in Chile, that he developed those ideas in a mature way. So it was because of his participation in debates in Chile, because he was very much interested in the practical application of his ideas, that his notion of free banking was developed there. So it was a product of his traveling. Now I come to Senior, Nassau Senior. Senior was an exception to the relative immobility of classical economists in the 19th century, British classical economists. So he was a very active traveler. He engaged in traveling very much. For instance, he was the only one to go as far as visit the Mediterranean area, like Egypt, Turkey, the Mid and the Near East. And this is apparently in contradiction with what Terence Hutchison described as Senior's armchair ultra-deductive methodology. So how to make sense of that in the context of Senior's overall writings? One way to do that is the fact that he was very much interested in in a field that was started by him, that is this investigation of different national characters. So after his travels to Turkey and to Egypt, he wrote chapters of books titled, for instance, Political and Social Institutions Affecting Industrial Enterprise. And one of the sections was National Character of the Turks as a Cause of Their Poverty. Usually his description of this national character of the Turks or of the Egyptians were a little bit, or maybe too biased. And they were based very much on conversation with Europeans who lived there. Not so much because he could not speak the language, so, and he did not use an interpreter apparently, so his ability to make sense of the reality surrounding him was a little bit limited. But he was very much interested in national characters, and that started before that with David Hume when he was on a diplomatic mission in Europe, and by traveling through several European countries, he came to the conclusion that national characters were different, and he wrote an essay about that, of national characters. So you see, David Hume, who had denied that traveling could really be an important source of information, was very much influenced by his own travels in Europe in order to reflect about differences in national characters. So now I come perhaps to the best known travel institution, so to speak, at the time in the 18th century, the Grand Tour. So the Grand Tour was quite important, especially people from England going to the continent, to Italy and France, but also economists were a minority. That was a general social phenomenon. But now here I'd like to pick two very important economists, James Stewart and Adam Smith. So they both undertook grand tours, but in the case of Adam Smith as a tutor. And Stewart was also in Europe for a long time in exile, for several years. So their experiences on the continent were important for them, but in very different ways. In the case of Stewart, it has been shown by experts that his book was very much influenced by the cosmopolitan view that he acquired during his travels in Europe, including in special his interaction with German cameralism when he stayed in Tübingen, the academic German town of Tübingen at the time. Adam Smith, on the other hand, for him, what was relevant was his contact with the physiocrats during the 2 years he spent in France. And that was absolutely crucial for the wealth of nations because that gave him the starting point for his approach to capital accumulation and to income distribution. And you don't see any traces of physiocratic influence in James Stewart. So the traveling in those two cases, the impact was quite different. Around the same time that Smith visited Paris, he came in contact with Denis Diderot, the French encyclopedist and philosophy, and who traveled at the time to St. Petersburg, invited by Catherine the Great to advise her on economic and a few other matters as well. What's interesting is that before the travel, he thought enlightened despotism was a solution to a shortcut to Russian advancement towards progress towards a civilization. But after his 7 or 6 months experience in St. Petersburg, he changed his mind completely. He thought, no, there is no way, this is a very long-term process. The huge income gap between poor and rich people, you cannot have a civilization under those circumstances, so traveling was important. But the most important traveler at the time really was Arthur Young, in the sense that he produced a lot of travel writing, of travel books in England and elsewhere in France in the 18th century. And maybe he's the most successful travel writer ever. He's the only one mentioned in Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis. Schumpeter describes him as a theory in action. It's a nice description. And of course, Malthus' trip to Scandinavia. This led to introduction of prudential checks in his population theory, which changed very much or changed significantly his, the classical approach to determination of the wage level. Again, Stigler thinks that this is irrelevant, but most historians of thought disagree with him. Neither Malthus nor Young, they traveled outside Europe. So when they needed information from other countries like Asia, India, and China, they issued instructions for travelers. That is, instructions for travelers to go there and get the information they were interested in. But by the beginning of the 19th century, that changed, because for the first time, you have this new phenomenon of the scientific traveler. A traveler that you could really trust, and that was Alexander von Humboldt, the German explorer. The first scientific traveler and travel writer. He traveled to New Spain, that is Mexico, between 1879 and 1804. So his narratives of his travelers, they had a huge impact. And in fact, 19th century science very much can be described as Humboldtian science, with involving traveling. So Darwin, Wallace, Tocqueville, they were all Humboldtian scientists in that sense. Darwin read Humboldt very closely, and he was very much inspired by Humboldt's travels. And his detailed reports of his travels to New Spain, Mexico, they caught the attention of the economists, of classical economists, especially Malthus, who used the evidence provided. He refers to Humboldt in several passages of his principles, and to make the point that economic growth is determined not by capital accumulation, but by demand, against Ricardo. Okay. And what about traveling to a more developed country? Like, and that was, of course, Great Britain at the time. And I think the best example of that is Friedrich Engels and Marx going to Manchester between 1842 and 45, and then Marx later on. Engels made very clear that in Manchester it was forcibly brought to my notice that economic facts, hitherto ignored or at least underestimated by historians, play a decisive role in the development of the modern world. That is, historical materialism, his whole approach to capitalism was brought out by his Manchester experience, and to some extent that also applied to Marx, who came invited by Engels himself. Okay. Now let's go back to traveling to America. It is intensified after the 1870s because the cost of traveling, transatlantic traveling, reduced very much. Marshall came to America in 1878. It took him less than 10 days to travel, while List, for instance, it took him almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Marshall is a particularly interesting case because his travel to US and Canada, it played a very important role in his professional life. So I have here this quotation from Keynes' biography of Marshall, showing that there is no doubt that that was a turning point in Marshall's career, and that affected his whole professional life, what the experience he had in the United States and Canada as well. Another very important example of an European visitor to the United States was Max Weber. So Max Weber, when he came to America, the first part of his classic book was already written, but not the second one. And then it was after his visit to the United States as he wrote the second part, and he found the evidence that he needed for his thesis about the relation between capitalism and Protestant ethic. So it was a product of his travel. Another important travel to the West was by Ronald Coase in 1931-32 on a scholarship coming from the LSE. By studying the conditions of production of American industries, he came to collect the material that and the insight that he used to develop his famous theory about the nature of the firm, published some years later. Another, maybe not so well-known example is Schumpeter's experience in Cairo in 1908. According to Schumpeter's biographer, it was when he, by taking part in innovation process in a firm where Schumpeter worked at the time, he for the first time experienced the importance of innovation that made a great impression on him. In the 20th century, things changed, in the sense that traveling became very much, the main focus of traveling became the socialist countries and the underdeveloped countries. So we have travels like Keynes going to Russia, and in 1925, that was important for his political views. Koopmans, 40 years later, coming to Russia again as the first academic visitor in 1965. Domer visited Russia in the 1950s. And political pilgrimage became very important to socialist countries, the search for utopia. And that's particularly the case with John Robinson, who visited China many times and in search for utopia, really. And that affected her work on a rational price system and the choice of techniques. Tinbergen is another interesting case of an economist visiting an underdeveloped country. When he visited India, that changed completely his research agenda. He said that poverty and the conditions of living in India, of life in India, made him change completely his research agenda. Here I have some other examples like Hirschman, Pollack coming to Mexico and developing the monetary approach to the balance of payments, Stolper in Nigeria, Martin Bronfenbrenner in Japan. That is a very dramatic illustration of the effects of traveling on an economist. Okay, so I think I have made here I suppose, the case that Stigler is not very accurate. So let's move to North Brazilian experience. His host in Rio was Eugênio Goudin, this Brazilian economist who at the time he had invited several other economists since the late 1940s, like Haberler, Weiner, Nurks, Singer, Robbins, Caldor, Bolding, and all the lectures were published in Revista Brasileira de Economia. And North came to Brazil as a neoclassical expert on regional economic growth. That was his expertise at the time. So his diary records what he saw in the Brazilian cities he visited. So for instance, Rio. In Rio, you have the favelas or check towns combined with nice residential areas. At the end of his trip, he said, I'm forced to admit that Rio is the most beautiful city I've ever seen. Why forced to admit? Because, yeah, and then he said, I'm afraid Rio is beautiful. Why am I afraid? And he said, it takes some time for the eyes to adjust. But at the end of the trip, when the eyes are adjusted, then you realize that there is no place like this in the whole world. And he said forced to admit because he was very critical of Brazilian society in general. So here's the thing. I mean, here is this guy who realized that this underdeveloped country has serious problems in terms of efficiency of the pricing mechanism, of the market economy, of government intervention, but at the same time is a country that had produced wonderful things. And for instance, the new capital, Brasilia, he visited in 1961, and Brasilia was founded in 1960. And he wrote in his diary, Brasilia is fantastic, Brasilia is sensational. Only Brazilians could produce some this aesthetic achievement like Brasilia. There is nothing like that. So he was overwhelmed by Brasilia. But at the same time that he wrote that, he said that but nobody but the Brazilians would have such an utter disregard for costs and economic efficiency. So that for him was very clear. At the same time, when he visited the capital, Brasilia, he came in contact with government officials, and that's when it struck him that intervention and control are everywhere. They are inefficient by any measures or standards. In Fortaleza, city in the Brazilian northeast region, he reflected on the northeast problem, especially underemployed people. Recife he described as a clear, desperate, poor area. So those were the impressions he got from his travels in Brazil. São Paulo was the exception, the city of São Paulo. That's the largest city in Brazil, the largest city in South America. And at the time, the Brazilian economy was doing relatively well with high rates of growth. And São Paulo was the showcase for that. So in São Paulo, the market spirit contrasted with bureaucratic planning elsewhere. So, and he was so enthusiastic about São Paulo that he wrote, let me see here, yeah. São Paulo is an extraordinary Latin American city. It simply doesn't belong there. It could be Chicago. It boasts that it is the most rapidly growing city in the whole world, and it certainly looks it. The wholesaling, retailing, and the whole atmosphere betokens a degree of efficiency and aggressive entrepreneurial spirit which simply isn't typical of Latin America. There can be no doubt that the Paulista influence is a major force in Brazilian expansion. In all the water of bureaucratic planners and wild schemes that mark this country, this city stands out as a vital center for creating expansion. Viva os paulistas, as they are called. Is there anyone from São Paulo here? So you see, this caught his eye. And I mean his eye, because that was a matter of observation, of walking on the streets, talking to people, seeing what was going on. And this contrast between São Paulo as the very center, dynamic center of Brazilian capitalism, or the market economy that could work, and the rest of the country, especially the capital and the poor areas of the Northeast, where government intervention was much present. And in his lectures in Rio, they reflected that. I mean, he made a point that economic efficiency was important, and that the market mechanism should work, and the government should not prevent that, and that the country Brazil was a gigantic mess. That was his perception. Celso Furtado intrigued him a little bit, his personality, the guy that I mentioned before. But then he eventually met Celso Furtado in Recife, and then he got a good impression from Furtado. The main issue there was overpopulation. According to North, the key to solve the Northeast poverty problem was immigration, was reducing population. And Furtado agreed in part. And according to the problem with Furtado, according to North, was this what he called the insidious influence of CEPAL. So at the time, CEPAL, the Latin American United Nations Commissions, the United Nations Commissions for Latin America, it was very much, there was a lot of hostility coming from the American government, and North shared that view. His model for regional economic growth was based on the effects of exports on regional markets. So Malthusian population pressure was not part of his original model, but then he changed that when he came to Brazil. And it was a sort of Harold-Domer approach as described here. So immigration would bring about the rise in real wages and would bring about also change in production technique with more capital-intensive agricultural methods. And Sudeni, he described it as a group of younger people. They are leftists, they are very close to being communists, they don't know how the market works, but they are so enthusiastic that their enthusiasm will prevail eventually. All right, so let me move here. And there is this interesting point that he made in his real lectures. I'm coming to the end of my presentation now. That it's interesting that when people travel abroad, maybe they feel some freedom to discuss points that they usually don't discuss at home with their familiar or usual audience. So for instance, in his, one of his real lectures, he wrote that he criticized this view that external economies and these economies could disappear through a legal structure in which firms and groups could recapture the gains or incur the costs which affect other groups. What is that? This is the Coase theorem. Steve Medema is not here, so I may take advantage of that to mention the Coase theorem in his absence. So that had been published the year before. And he's criticizing the Coase theorem here. And he would come back to that only 20 years later. So his experience in Brazil was very brief, but also very arduous. Okay, so now the end of our journey. Let's come to the conclusion. It was only in the 1980s that North would come back to that. I mean economic underdevelopment. Before that, economic growth failures were treated as an anomaly. I mean, he very much focused his attention on successful economies like American and the Western European economies. And it was an anomaly resulting from this unexplained persistence of inefficient economic institutions. It's interesting that one of the mechanisms to explain the endogenous, in an endogenous way, how institutions are created was exactly population pressure. So population pressure became important in North in the 1970s, and I believe the reason, the first time he got that idea was during his visit to Brazil. So this was this Malthusian argument became important in his framework in the 1970s. And why institutions relevant? Because of these transaction costs. And because of that, property rights are essential. So according to Norton, he wrote that in the 1980s. He came back to his real lecture saying that the Coase theorem is wrong. And here you have a second important travel to a developing country that was to Peru in 1980, when this matter of transaction costs became really central to his agenda. So why he became so interested in Latin America all of a sudden? Because from his perspective, the comparative economic performance of Latin America and North America, that is United States and Canada, provided the best evidence of the importance of institutions for economic growth. Because what distinguished the American experience, or the North American experience from the Latin American experience, were their different institutions. And the fact, and poverty had to do with high transaction costs that do not provide the right incentives for economic growth and the working of the market mechanism. In the case of Latin America, they were characterized by this centralized bureaucratic control and personalistic exchange relationships. Okay, where did he experience that for the first time? During his visit to Brazil. So it all came back to him when he was working on his ideas about the role of institutions in economic growth. So he observed many of those features firsthand in his travel to Brazil. And this also applies to his concept of beliefs and ideologies. That's something that you can very clearly detect in his travel diaries and his perceptions and writings of the capitalist spirit of São Paulo, for instance, the ideology of Cepal and of Sudene in the Northeast, all that came back later. He referred to his experience abroad as playing God. That is, playing God in the sense of advising foreign governments and to improve their performance and so forth. The first time he played God in his life was in his trip to Brazil in 1961. I'll come back to Goethe later. So my conclusion here is that based on this investigation of North's visit to Brazil and the data set that I showed to you before, that the history of economics is really richer if you take into account economists' travels. I mean, they can really contribute to a better understanding of how economic ideas are produced, especially when institutional differences are relevant, as it was exactly the case of North's visit to Brazil. Of course, economists, they don't usually pay too much attention to traveling, although indirectly, when you take a look at the kind of travel fiction they refer to, there are two classic books of travel fiction that have been very influential in economics. Utopia by Thomas More, and of course Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. It's interesting that in 2003, this literature of travel and exploration was published with everything that you can imagine about travel writing, and there is just one reference to an economist. That was Arthur Young, and that's all. There's nothing else. No economist is mentioned there apart from Arthur Young. And more recently, Routledge has this series of books on travel writing from several different perspectives, and only now, this year, finally, a book on travel writing by economists or economic travel writing is coming out by Brian Cooper. It's about travel writing in the classical period. So it has taken a long time. More recently, I mean, in the last 40 years or so, China has become the focus or the main focus of traveling. So you have economists like John Kenneth Galbraith went to China in 1972, the first time a Western economist traveled to China on an official visit, who wrote his travel log of his trip in 1973. Milton Friedman, of course, Ken Arrow, James Tobin, and others. So very recently, this year, a book about economists traveling to China was published written by Gevertz. Is an Oxford PhD thesis in history. So I started with a quotation from Douglas North, as you may remember. So I would like to end my presentation with a quotation from Goethe, the famous German writer who traveled to Italy, and his Italian journeys are among the better known, the most famous travel reports ever written, and they also contain several remarks about economics, about as he perceived it. So forget what was important was the sensorial perception of what he saw around him and how this affected him, including not just works of art and landscape, but also the society and the Italian economy. So that's his a statement taken from his book, that though, I will just read the end of it, though I am still always myself, I believe I have been changed by traveling to the very marrow of my bones. And I believe this is very often the case. Thank you.